Hello, this is Justin Williams with the Wolfpacker Podcast. I'm joined today, as always, by co-host Matt Carter, and we've got a fun show planned ahead for you guys. We're going to talk about our impressions of our Q&As with head football coach Dave Doeren and offensive coordinator Tim Beck, as well as defensive coordinator Tony Gibson. We did these interviews in preparation for the upcoming Wolfpacker magazine, the football preview special, which is off to print right now. If you're a Wolfpack Club member, you should be getting that magazine mailed to you here in the month of July. And if you're not a Wolfpack Club member, head over to the wolfpackeronline.com where you can order a copy for yourself. It's a great issue, complete football preview of the upcoming 2021 season. A lot of good stuff in there from these interviews. And if you want to read the Q&As in their entirety, you can head over to thewolfpacker.com, and it's a great reason to use promo code PACK60. That's promo code PACK60 for a free 60-day trial on all of our premium content, news, and analysis. These stories are premium stories, so you'll need to use that promo code PACK60 to unlock the full Q&As. You will be able to see some of the questions and answers on there for free, however, to give you a little preview of what's talked about. And, of course, we're going to talk about our impressions of those interviews here today. Quick reminder before we get into that, for the listeners at home, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen to us. We're on the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, Google Play, everywhere you listen to podcasts. Plus, you can always stream us on thewolfpacker.com. So, Matt, let's jump right into it. Let's go with the head coach first because he's the head honcho and he deserves to go first. So you conducted the phone interview with head coach Dave Doeren. He had, at that point, it was late June, so he was already past spring practice, was towards the end of what was a very busy month for him and his football staff of recruiting for the 2022 class, 9 commits in the month of June. It seemed like almost every other day there was a commit coming in for NC State, but Matt, let's talk about more big picture stuff, which was the main topic of discussion that you had with Dave Doeren. What were your just overall impressions from how Dave Doeren was feeling this summer heading into the fall, what he saw in spring practice, and just the level of excitement around this program right now? Because obviously there's a lot of external attention, but what's your read on the internal attitude this summer?
Yeah, I have to say, too, each of these interviews were two parties, and I think the last two questions of the second part of Dave Doeren's interview were the most revealing. And I kind of teased one of them on Twitter, so I feel okay with repeating with what he said. And he said, quote, "This is a team that has had failure. They've had success. They know what both feel like. They want to take the program to another level, and they are really motivated to do that." And, and then, quite frankly, in the other question, I kind of asked them, that was in response to what their motivation is this year, because, last year it was easy to have motivation, right? You're coming off a 4-8 season, you went 1-7 in the ACC, everybody's writing you off, nobody's paying attention to you, and you're trying, no matter how much you tell it, nobody wants to hear that, hello, we lost everybody and everyone of consequence almost to injury during the season, and it was just a ridiculous set of circumstances. And so it was easy to have that chip on your shoulder. So I'm curious what the motivation was this year, and that was Dave Doeren's response. But the question before that, I just kind of said, big picture, how do you feel? And you can tell Dave Doeren feels like this team can be good. They need some breaks with the injuries, like every other team, not named Alabama and Clemson and Ohio State. And they need something to fall their way, but they truly feel they can be good. And that was kind of what I took away from it, talking to him. And sometimes verbalization of something versus reading something comes across differently, as we all know, right? The proverbial text message, or in the case of the Wolfpacker, the message board post that is probably dripping with sarcasm, but somebody reading it can't tell that. So I'd be curious to know what your thought was reading it, because I know what Dave Doeren was expressing to me, because I was, was still not doing live interviews yet, so it was still over the phone in all these cases. But I know what I was hearing on the phone line. So I was curious what your thoughts were reading it, particularly those last two questions.
Well, I'm glad you brought up those last two questions because I thought it was a great way to just kind of close out the entire Q&A, right? When you have the head coach on the phone for, 20, 30 minutes, you want to get in as many good questions as you can. There's no time for fluff. You want to ask the particular questions about position battles and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you also want to have, a big picture outlook on everything that was already discussed. And I thought those last two quotes did exactly that. It's interesting that he brought up that this is a team that has both had failure and success, because I think that's an important reminder for those outside of the program, because when you're not in the locker room every day and you're not going out to the summer workout sessions and, humid 95-degree heat, it's easy to have a short memory. And it's easy to think back, okay, this is just a team that's going to grow from its 8-4 season in 2020, and that's the only thing that can happen. But the truth of the matter is they still got to go out and produce, and they got to win these games or lose these games, and the outcomes have to play themselves out. So the fact that they have had that experience of failure from 2019, because a lot of these guys that are going to be key contributors in 2021 were a part of that team in 2019. There really hasn't been a lot of roster turnover over the past two seasons, compared to what you would typically expect in a normal college football roster turnover type situation. So it's interesting because one previous answer that he had to one of your questions, there was kind of the attitude that the team had 4 wins in 2019. They had 8 wins in 2020. And then the goal this year is 12 wins. They want to be the best team in the conference, which is the goal that you should have if you're a team, you're a competitive athlete, you're competitive coaches, you're trying to win championships. That should be your mentality at the Division I level. Of course, us on the outside, us in media, we have to be a little bit more realistic based on the body of work that we've seen. I don't think anybody out there is predicting that NC State's going to go win 12 games. Now, we are out here saying that this has the potential to be a very special season for NC State, considering how much returning talent is coming back after a successful campaign in 2020. But the schedule is going to be a lot different. There's going to be a return to normalcy. And as Dave Doeren mentioned in one of his other answers, NC State's not the only team in the conference, let alone the country, that has a lot of returning talent coming back. I think he mentioned, he brought up Pittsburgh as one team that's bringing back, over a dozen super seniors exercising their extra year of eligibility that the NCAA granted in preparation that the season last year could have been canceled or significantly impacted by COVID-19. Of course, in hindsight, maybe that was a knee-jerk reaction. Maybe it was an unnecessary solution to what was going on. However, NC State has 4 of those guys, and it is an experienced roster. There, you look at all the returning starters. I mean, you could make a case that NC State's got as many as 19, returning starters if you're counting Devin Leary, a guy that was supposed to be the starter at quarterback last year, but only got to start 3 times because of injuries. There is that returning talent there, but everybody else has that too. So you're not getting the sense that this team is content and is kind of lackadaisically going into 2021, expecting that there's just going to be a natural progression. They understand that they have to put in the same amount of work they did in preparation of the 2020 season to get the type of improvement and results on the field that they're expecting in 2021. So, I thought it was a very genuine answer from Dave Doeren. He's a guy that's going to call it like it is. When you talk to these recruits after they commit, one of the questions I always ask them is, what's your interactions with Dave Doeren like? What was your conversations with him like? What do you think of him? And almost every time their answers are that he's such a genuine guy. He keeps it real. And you can't say that about every coach in the country. And I know it's probably more common in football, but it's true. Dave Doeren keeps it like it is, and I thought that was the case in the Q&A. So that was what I thought, Matt.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point that can't get lost. This is an experienced football team, but I think that was Dave Doeren being honest and saying that shows everybody else. So he's not banking on that. In a normal year, if he had this amount of returning talent coming, that could be something he could bank on, but that's not something he's banking on here because, as he noted, all those super seniors at Pittsburgh and everything of that nature. It's valuable, as he brought up. It's, he used Emeka Emeji. You know what you're getting with Emeka Emeji, which is really good. He didn't say that. I'm saying that. That's really good. You could have a sophomore and try to say that he could be as good or better as Emeka Emeji, but you don't know that because you've never seen him on the field. He might be, but you can't honestly say that. And so that's what the experience brings you. I will say, as an aside, David Hale did a nice little chart and basically broke it down position by position of where the returning starters were. And I think NC State and maybe Syracuse led the way, not in the traditional sense of returning starters or as Bill Connolly does it, returning production, but more like returning starters at a position group or returning most starters at each position group. And NC State and Syracuse, I want to say, were the only two teams that maybe had it at every single position. I think he gave a caveat for Devin Leary being probably the opening game starter had he not been and lost a couple of weeks with contact tracing. So it's interesting. While Doeren is technically right, every team does have that boatload of experience returning. NC State still is in a pretty good position compared to a lot of the ACC in that category. So, but I think you bring up a good point. It would be smart for a coach like Dave Doeren not to just say, "Oh, we're experienced. We got that advantage." And it shows he's doing his homework because he clearly knew the number of Pittsburgh super seniors and he knew the other rosters in the ACC. So it's a guy who's been doing his homework in the offseason and studying up and preparing for what he's going to face. A lot of people don't know this, that a lot of the game planning is done during the offseason. This is when a lot of the scouting is done. A lot of the look aheads are done. This is the time you can get to break down your opponents. And then during the season, it's like pulling the book back out, dusting it off and reviewing it and taking a quick look at what they've done this year and updating what you need to update on it. But, the hard work is being done right now and has already probably been done on preparing for teams this fall.
On the topic of returning production, there was another question that you asked Dave Doeren that jumped out to me, and his response jumped out to me as well, in the sense that you asked him, have you ever had this much returning experience? And he had a short answer, but his answer was basically Bradley Chubb.
Short as in it wasn't long, not short as in short with me.
Right, I'm just saying it was it was brief and to the point. He didn't want to dwell on it because I don't think he wanted to go down the rabbit hole that I went down in the article that I wrote. But Bradley Chubb's senior season was the 2017 season, which, Wolfpack fans will remember probably the best team in recent history that NC State has put on the field, just in terms of overall talent, future NFL talent. That team was stacked with future NFL pros. And I wrote a story about it, comparing the 2017 roster to the 2021 roster, because the context of those two seasons are kind of similar. NC State's going into the year off of a good season where maybe they weren't, a dominant team, but they handled business against teams they were supposed to beat. They were competitive against teams that they were, probably underdogs going into those games. And I think 2021 is kind of, in terms of preseason expectations, you think back to 2017 because of all these guys that could go on and have NFL careers, and you're going to look back on this team and say, oh man, look at all this talent that was on this team. But that story, I'm not saying that this team is going to be the same team that 2017 was. I think top-end talent-wise, the 2017 team, as we sit here today before the 2021 season, probably had superior top-end talent. If you look at, a guy like Bradley Chubb, who's a top 5 overall pick. I'm not sure if there's any top 10 picks on this team unless Ike Ekwonu goes out and has like 100 pancake blocks this year, which could happen. I don't know. Would love to see that. But what's different about this team is just the the two deep depth. If you look at the top 40 to 45 guys on this team and you stacked them up against the top 40 to 45 guys on the 2017 team, you might want to take your chances with the 2021 team just because there's a lot more competition at some of these position groups. You've got really good young talent, but you've got experience and you've got good problems on your hand, whereas 2017, you kind of knew who was going to be playing, right? And it's interesting because, if given the option, I think fans would still probably rather have that top-end talent, but that's not necessarily the recipe for, having a double-digit win season in college football. The recipe is having the type of roster that's going to be able to have the longevity to have success, not just in the first 2 weeks of the season, but on into the months of November and December when all of a sudden you're looking at a handful of injuries of key guys that are contributors, and you've got to look to the 2 and sometimes 3 deep and say, we need you to go out there and produce for us. And I think this roster is really shaped to do that. And, in these conversations with Dave Doeren and also with Tim Beck and Tony Gibson, I think they all kind of alluded to the fact that there's really strong depth on this team. Did you get that impression as well, Matt?
Yeah, I definitely would. And that was one of the things I talked about with both Dave Doeren and Tony Gibson. Last year, the group was the safety group. Obviously, there was a huge injury at quarterback. But the group that was really hit hard was the safety group, which ironically was the one group that they were most worried about depth-wise in the preseason. And Doeren kind of just, laughingly said, that's just, basically, I don't know why it is, but it always seems to, it's like the guy who gets subbed into a baseball game for a defensive where he's being subbed in because there's been an injury, and he goes in and plays shortstop. And inevitably, the first bouncer goes where, right? To the new guy in the game that's coming in cold and hasn't had a whole lot of chance to warm up and play a lot. So it seems like injuries will find their way to that one position group that's thinnest on depth. But I would say, yeah, Dave Doeren rather bluntly said that they felt like the roster was built well to withstand injury, barring catastrophe, which just about any, even Clemson, if it had a catastrophic string of injuries and it was down to like 4 or 5 linebackers, they would struggle at that point, especially if it's mainly reserve linebackers. So they felt like barring catastrophic, an epidemic of injuries, that they'd be pretty good to withstand that. And both, Tony Gibson and Dave Doeren specifically mentioned adding some of the transfers in the secondary, Derek Pitts, Cyrus Fagan, getting some guys healthy back, Khalid Martin, Rakeem Ashford, Chris Ingram, Taysom Smith, getting all those guys back had really, you really kind of put an influx of talent back into the group that was missing last year. So they seem, if you want to knock on wood, if you're an NC State fan listening to this and you got word around you, go ahead and knock on it, that they seem to think that they could, they're in as good a position that they could be, certainly aided by having 6 seniors back for repeat senior years to withstand some of these injuries going forward.
Well, let's transition over to offense and defense. We'll start with offensive coordinator Tim Beck, which was the interview that I conducted, and we can transition by comparing the answers from Dave Doeren and Tim Beck. And there was one area, I think it was at the end of part 1 maybe, that was an area of emphasis. You asked Dave Doeren, what was an area of emphasis on offense this summer after last season? And he talked about short yardage situations on third and 1, 4th and 1, if you're going to go for it, if you're not. He talked about being able to run the ball consistently, and I thought Tim Beck gave probably a more, not candid's the right word, but I think Tim Beck as the offensive coordinator taking identity and ownership of the offense. I think he was allowing himself to be a little bit more self-critical, whereas Dave Doeren's probably thinking, considering the context of everything that happened with, a new offensive coordinator and you miss most of your offseason due to COVID, I think most rational people will be pretty happy with the results on offense because the offense did drastically improve from 2019 to 2020. But Tim Beck was pretty blunt in the sense that he was not impressed with the running performance. It's something that is an emphasis on this offense heading into 2021, that you've got a stacked group of running backs. Phil Steele in his college football preview magazine ranks NC State the best running back position group in the ACC, higher than Clemson and UNC and everybody. I mean, that's not due to a lack of competition. There's a lot of great running back rooms in the ACC. So to get a guy like Phil Steele, who knows what he's talking about, ranking NC State at number 1 in terms of running back position groups, that shows you that there's talent in that running back room. And you look at the offensive line and you look at how they're graded out, how they performed throughout the season in 2020. It was a position group that seemed to have a strength in run blocking versus pass protection. NC State was kind of towards the bottom of the league in terms of sack allowances and quarterback pressures. Now, some of that is due to who's in the game at quarterback, who's pass protecting in the running back situation, how are the tight ends doing. It's not all the offensive line's fault, but you've got a formidable offensive line that seems to have a strength in the running game, and you've got really talented running backs. And then you look at NC State's running yards per game in the ACC. I think it ranked, off the top of my head, 12th out of 15 teams, because you're including Notre Dame in that last season in 2020. When you've got that much talent in a particular element of the offense, you kind of expect a little bit better statistical results. The statistics don't tell the entire story, but they do tell part of the story. And, Tim Beck did mention that he is a guy that likes to get the running backs involved in the passing game. So there are some situations where if he calls a screen pass, or if he calls, a passing play that's directed to a running back on a short pass, he kind of considers that a run in and of itself. But he was saying that there is a lot of room for improvement, and he agreed with me in the sense that there's a ton of talent in that area, and the results were a little bit mind-boggling last year. So, what were your impressions? Because you were on the phone with Dave Doeren, so maybe the tone was a little bit different. Maybe you could catch, what he was thinking there. But what's kind of your impression of the running game going into 2021 with the talent on hand, but coming off a year where I think it'd be fair to say that NC State was about a middle-of-the-road running team in the ACC last year?
Yeah, and I kind of thought that Tim Beck's answer about run block versus pass block was interesting. It's interesting. If you go by Pro Football Focus grades, you would have thought NC State was all right running the football. Statistically, they were not. And they had some guys that were really good grading out run blocking. Obviously, Bam Knight was a tremendous graded out performer by Pro Football Focus. But it was interesting is that Tim Beck kind of, I don't know, you talked to him, so it almost seems like he kind of pushed back on that notion a little bit, as if to say, actually, the pass blocking wasn't as bad as people thought. Some of that was on other people. Some of it was on the quarterback or a running back missing a block. And that it was the run blocking that he wanted to get better, which I think is probably what Dave Doeren was alluding to with short yardage situation. And that was a weakness last year, the inability to pick up 3rd and 1, sustain a drive. And we know Dave Doeren likes to be aggressive going for it on 4th down. So I was probably more interested when it came to the running game. I was probably very interested in that answer from Tim Beck in that regard. Obviously on paper, it's one of the better running back groups in the ACC. To be fair, UNC lost their 2 stud running backs. Clemson lost their all-time ACC rushing leader. So there were some big losses in the ACC this year that kind of probably puts NC State up a couple of rings in the rings in the ladder, if you will. So, I agree with you. I think compared to the talent level and the hype, some of it based on recruiting, and the fact that if you're looking, you got a potential All-American center in Grant Gibson, you got a potential All-American left tackle in Ike Ekwonu. You got a potential pro running back in Bam Knight. You got another potential high-level college running back who could even sneak into the pro consideration with great year and Ricky Person. you probably expected better results. I will go back to what Eric McLean said when we had him on the podcast too. Coaches know better than us, and maybe that's part of why Dave Doeren was thinking the way he thought. That it could have been a function of teams, particularly when Devin Leary got hurt, basically saying, yeah, we're going to make Bailey Hockman beat us, and we're going to stack the box and take away the run and sell out against the run. So I don't know how much that was an element of what happened, but I don't know. I just thought the answer about the offensive line really stood out to me from Tim Beck.
I think it's also important to remember when looking at the production from last season, you have to take them in with a grain of salt, because you're also, what NC State did last year was spectacular when you consider that you have 2 new coordinators going into a season coming off of a 4-8 year, and then you get your entire spring practice canceled. You basically have to do all of summer virtually. Then you finally get in person in the fall, and you have to shut that down in the middle of the fall session because there's a COVID outbreak. And then you get back, a couple weeks before the opener, and you got to be ready to roll. And once you get into the season, you're not introducing new stuff. You've just got to prepare with what you've got. And it was interesting where there was some, connected elements to Doeren's answers and Beck's answers, in the sense that, kind of how I started off my interview with Tim Beck was asking him, how much were you really able to run of your playbook, what you would do in a normal year comparatively last year, considering all of the context of last season's limited offseason. And, he was not trying to make he thought that the players did a really great job of picking up what he called the meat and potatoes, just kind of the base of the offense. But I think Doeren kind of put it best when he said we're probably going to get more creative in some of our play calls in 2021, because they're going to have that ability to introduce new plays, new systems, new formations to these players, with an entirety of having a summer, spring, fall together all in the same room. It's just so much easier and more efficient to do that when you're all in person rather than learning it, over a Zoom session. But maybe that's one other thing that you should probably be looking for in terms of, run production from 2020 to 2021. I thought you brought up a great point in the sense that when you lose your starting quarterback in Devin Leary, you get a guy like Bailey Hockman, who's a really good game manager. And if NC State didn't have Bailey Hockman, they wouldn't have had 8 wins last year. Let's go ahead and get that on the record. Bailey Hockman was absolutely a positive contribution for NC State last year. But he was limited, and he didn't have the deep ball type threat that Devin Leary did. So yes, defenses probably gravitated toward let's stop the run and let's make Bailey Hockman beat us, whereas they might take a different strategy with a guy like Devin Leary. But there's also the sense that if you're kind of sticking to the basics of your play calling, that gives the defenses a little bit easier of a task to stop these run plays, whereas if you can get more creative with the play calling, then you can set up a play for a Bam Knight or a Ricky Person to go off and break one off for 60 yards and a touchdown. And of course, then all of the statistical results are going to look a whole lot better. So I don't know. I think that's just one thing that when you look at 2020, you just got to take everything with a grain of salt.
Yeah. And I do think that's a common thread with all 3 of the interviews. Dave Doeren mentioned the offense was probably a little bit more vanilla than what it'll be this year when they have more time to get stuff in. And you mentioned Tim Beck brought up the fact that they basically only had one running play in the offense a couple of years ago, and it's now much more diversified. So these running backs are trying to learn new running plays, new running schemes, and they just had a limited amount of time to do it. So that was another element of all of this that probably gets lost on the average fan. And then Tony Gibson, not to jump ahead to Tony Gibson, but he mentioned the same thing where I think he said he thought they got maybe 70% of the defense in last year. A lot of that was actually done on game week. Like they would say during a game week, all right, let's work on installing this part of the defense. And it never happened like that. And he thought of that 70%, they were probably executing at about a 50% level of what they wanted to be. And Tim Beck, I think, kind of made an allusion to that, of the ability to execute what they wanted. So it does get lost, and I thought Dave Doeren rightfully gave the players a lot of credit for handling it too. As he said, not every time is the player coachable or open to being coached, and that last year's team, which by all accounts had great leadership, and this year's team, by all accounts, has great leadership, took to the coach and they embraced it and they worked with it, and it was a good chemistry and a good meshing, I guess, as you would say, of coaches and players that was able to pull that off. But yeah, I do think that it's an excellent point that gets lost, and they just didn't get a whole lot of chances to work on their offense and defense, and they didn't get a chance to put everything in. And what they did put in, they weren't executing it at a high enough level yet, because they hadn't repped it in practice. So it'll be very interesting to see what they look like, both from a play calling standpoint and a confidence standpoint this fall. So, and I think the other thing that was similar between Dave Doeren and Tim Beck, they both seemed 100% confident in Devin Leary.
It was like you were just reading my mind, Matt, because totally, you're reading my mind right now, because I was like, I just set up the perfect transition for us to go on to Tony Gibson and talk about the defense. But then I remembered, oh yeah, we got to talk about Devin Leary, the starting quarterback who, had a season-ending injury last year.
And real quick, to all our listeners, the other thing that's on Justin's mind right now is, what am I going to get from Jersey Mike tomorrow at lunch when I'm back in the office? Go ahead, Justin.
Okay. All right. Well, now you're.
Am I right?
This is getting freaky. Get out of my brain. You're like. You're like Brooks Koepka and I'm Bryson DeChambeau. You're living in my brain rent free right now, Matt. But yes, on the point of Devin Leary, both Tim Beck and Dave Doeren, with no hesitation in their voice, were emphatic on the fact that Devin Leary looked as good, if not better, than he did the last time he was able to take the field for the Wolfpack, coming off that season-ending injury, which was pretty gruesome for those that were in attendance, at the NC State Duke game. And I talked to Devin Leary personally for a story that I wrote for the football preview, and he also echoed those same thoughts, that I still think that there is an element that you've got to get back to those live hits and reps in a game before you really know if he's 100% back. But at least from the sounds of it in the preseason, I think there would be some alarm bells coming off if anybody was to come out and say, there is going to take some time to get back into the rhythm of things, or it is going to take him some time this summer to get back to where he was before. And that just doesn't seem to be the case. He seemed to be, running from the get-go in spring, and that should allow him to, focus on developing and his leadership, and also just learning the system 100% in its entirety, heading into the fall. So I think that's good news on the offensive front. But I do want to transition to Tony Gibson, because there is a good amount to talk about on the defense. But Matt, you were the guy that conducted that interview, so I'll give the floor to you. Just your general impressions from Tony Gibson, because that 70% quote, that he was only able to get in about 70% of his defensive playbook in by the end of the year, mind you, not for the opener, by the end of the year. And if you look at NC State's 2020 results, that defense was really starting to come into its own at the end of the season. They had struggled at times during the beginning of the year, into the middle of the year, but that Liberty game, that was one on defense. That Georgia Tech game, that was one on defense. And it makes a lot of sense with the benefit of hindsight that, well, if they only knew about 50% of the playbook, yeah, it makes sense that as the season goes along and they get more comfortable in the system, they're going to play better. But just your overall thoughts beyond just the playbook element, where's Tony Gibson at, as we're here about 2 months away from the season opener for the 2021 year?
It's interesting. Both Tony Gibson and Dave Doeren had a similar train of thought that the issues that they saw on defense last year were primarily injury related. And they both thought that being healthy was going to be a major component to to improving from last year. And I think Tony Gibson was very pleased with about Liberty game onward with where the defense was. Yeah, remember that for being as short-handed as they were, they played great in that bowl game against Kentucky. Kentucky wasn't a prolific offense by any stretch of the imagination. It helped that Georgia Tech didn't have a field goal kicker, but they did hold Georgia Tech in check in that game and got some red zone stops that probably otherwise would have been field goals, but they still red zone stops. They won touchdowns in the red zone. That's for sure. And so I think there was a feeling that the defense was really starting to turn the corner, was really starting to click. And I think the hope is from both of them that just by getting some of these injured guys back, and probably behind the paywall, I think with the Tanner Engel answer from Tony Gibson. So I won't give all of that away, but a very interesting answer from Tony Gibson on Tanner Engel and how they're so much better when he's on the field. And so they have to keep him on the field, and they're working on that this year. Obviously, the linebackers are the linebackers, and everybody knows that. But, I really think that both Doeren and Gibson think getting the secondary healthy, adding the 2 transfers, will really make a big difference to defense. Now that they are more comfortable, they'll be able to install everything this year, build off of what they did last season. I think there's hope that it can be a pretty good defense. Here's the caveat. I've said it before. I'll say it again. More so for the old-timers like me. What we call a good defense needs to be recalibrated, so to speak, right? It's the days of saying, let's hold a team to 350 yards of total offense and 2 touchdowns or less. Well, that's an exceptional day at the office now. That's exceptional. Good may be holding a team to 24 points or less and giving up right around 400 yards. That might now be what's considered average or good or whatever you want to call it, because the offenses have gotten so good and so sophisticated, and coordinators have gotten very good at pinpointing where to go on a defense. So, but that's what stood out to me. There was a level of confidence that if we just stay healthy and get our healthy guys back and these transfers can step up, we're going to be pretty good on defense.
And I would also add in there that the goalpost should probably change based on the opponent. I mean, if the points that are acceptable to allow against a team like Duke should be different than your goal going into the Clemson game. If NC State can hold Clemson to 30 points or less, then that's probably a successful day in the office for the defense for NC State. Whereas, a team like Duke that had its struggles, you probably don't want to be giving up more than 3 touchdowns to that team. So, but one answer from Gibson that stood out to me was talking about filling in, probably the biggest departure this offseason, and Aleem McNeil at nose tackle, obviously the highest draft pick in the 2021 NFL draft from NC State. But Gibson seems pretty confident in the sense that he's got a lot of options to fill in on that defensive line. I mean, look, it's a 3-man front, so it's not like, if you've got 6 or 7 great options, your 2 deep's looking pretty solid there. But, you look at a transfer like Corey Durden, you look at a guy like C.J. Clark that really split snaps with Aleem McNeil for most of the season last year. He didn't have the type of production that Aleem McNeil had, but it wasn't apples and oranges. C.J. Clark was a very solid ACC player last season as a sophomore, and he's going to get better as he steps into the role as being that main guy. So it's interesting when you look at both the defensive line and the secondary on defense. Going into 2020, the depth was certainly a question mark for both of those position groups, or position group areas, if you will, on the defense going into last season. And this season, I mean, depth seems to be a strength on both the defensive line and in the secondary. Is that kind of the vibe that you got, Matt?
I think so. And I didn't ask Dave Doeren necessarily. He seemed very content with the defensive line. He just said it's a matter of figuring out the rotation. They definitely feel more excited about having the bodies back in the secondary. But I did sense from Tony Gibson that he was not that concerned about losing Eileen McNeil, and maybe that's because Daniel Joseph is back. We know previously from the spring they were raving about Savion Jackson's development. They obviously brought in Corey Durden from Florida State. I'm sure they're counting on that. They know what he can do because they've seen it at the ACC level. So they're probably counting on that to be a nice, smooth transition and that he can fit right in. Got some younger guys that are just simply getting older, like C.J. Clark, like Davin Van, who had a true freshman season. Travali Price had a very good spring game. So Terrell Dawkins, didn't even mention him. He just played his first year and had a very nice first year. So, I think they feel like this, maybe it lost a very important individual piece, but the sum of the parts is probably better than it was last year. And I think that's what maybe they're banking on. But no question, it definitely sounded like Tony Gibson was very, very pleased with where the defensive line is right now.
Well, I figure a good way to wrap up this podcast, Matt, would be to just ask you, and then I'll give my answer, does your impression of this 2021 team, has it changed at all since conducting these interviews and writing the Football Preview magazine? Because I know I've picked up a few things here along the way, but I just want to know if it changes anything for you, if, I'm not asking for record predictions or anything like that, but does your overall outlook change at all on this team, after these conversations?
I think so. Look, got to remember, these coaches are optimistic by nature during the off season, and then it totally flips once they get into football season. I probably had a better appreciation particularly from the two guys I talked to, of the comfort level they have with where the roster is right now, where they are at right now. From reading Tim Beck, where Devin Leary is at right now, which, Devin Leary really is the centerpiece to a lot of this, because a lot of those other pieces and parts are known commodities. It's really what will we get from a full season of Devin Leary? Knock on wood that he's healthy. That's the key component to all this, and it felt like they feel good after spring about that. So, when you, at least from the two coaches I talked to, when you sense that kind of optimism, and it wasn't coach speak, it was more honest true feelings type speak, that gives you a little bit more of a better vibe about where they feel this team is. But I don't know if it would change my win-loss prediction from whenever we did that podcast with Joe Giglio. If you want to go look it back up on the Podbean or YouTube channel.
We all said 8-4. Spoiler alert.
Well, I was trying to get them to go watch the podcast, Justin.
We'll go watch the podcast, because there was a lot of good stuff on there from the Russell Wilson podcast that Joe and Joe did over there at 99.9 The Fan. And yes, subscribe to our YouTube channel and give this video a thumbs up and give that video a thumbs up. And also drop comments in both of them.
I like how you did that. But I do. Because the schedule. That's what I was going to say earlier. The schedule is still the schedule, and there's some tricky spots to it early that they have to navigate. That Dave Doeren said they got to go handle business. But you do feel a little bit better about their potential to handle that business. But ultimately, they have to show it. They have to prove it. They have to do it. And that's something that had been an NC State problem for a long time now.
I think I'm with you in the sense that, I don't think it really changes my perspective of this team going into the 2020 season a whole lot. But if anything, I think I would go a little bit more towards the optimistic side after having these conversations, because I also got the same vibe that you got from both Dave Doeren and Tony Gibson. I got that from Tim Beck, in the sense that, yes, they're very confident about where they're at with their roster situation, and they're not shying away from the expectations going into this year. I think they know that I think everybody around the program, within the program and outside the program, knows that a lot is going into 2021, and this is a year to circle, and this is a year that could be a very special year for NC State. One that you look back 10 years down the road and say, this is among the best of the decade. So they're not shying away from that, and it's not the conventional coach speak, like you said. I thought you put that perfectly in the sense that I did get a lot of genuine answers from Tim Beck, and I think you had the same from Dave Doeren and Tony Gibson. The main thing that really stood out to me was just the consensus between Devin Leary, Tim Beck, and Dave Doeren about where Devin Leary is, because I ultimately think that Devin Leary is the wild card of this season, and how well he performs is ultimately, that will unlock the potential of this team. If Devin Leary can be a above average ACC quarterback this season, then NC State can have a very special year, considering all of the returning talent, with the expectation that they stay healthy and that everybody that's returning, all of the producers that are returning, that production level stays the same or improves from that. But Leary's the question mark. You only saw him for 3 starts last year. He had a limited sample size in his first season getting playing time as a redshirt freshman in a year that was pretty much lost by the time he came in, and of course he had to face the toughest part of that schedule. So this is really the first time that Devin Leary's going to go onto the field with a lot of expectations, because I think there were still a lot of question marks about Devin Leary going into 2020, and he exceeded those in that first start that he had against Pittsburgh, just absolutely lighting up that Panthers defense that was so highly regarded by everyone. For him to put together the 330-plus yard, 4-touchdown performance that he did, and to lead that come from behind touchdown drive in the final seconds of the game like he did, I think that made NC State fans super excited about Devin Leary. And I think the thing is just be cautious about getting a little bit ahead of schedule. That was his career performance to date, and can he do that again multiple times this season? We'll see. And based on the answers that we received from everybody involved, all the characters involved, I think that everyone is kind of the thinking that that can be the case, that Devin Leary is going to continue to progress back to full health with all this returning talent around him. So I don't think there's any reason to doubt that not only the offense can be better than it was last year, but so can the defense. And the special teams was already pretty darn good, but even there's room for improvement there. And if you're improving in all 3 facets of the game like that, then, to go from an 8-4 season, yes, you're going to have a harder schedule in 2021 than you did last year. But to have the success on the field like you did last year, with the improvement that's expected, it's not my prediction, but a double-digit win season is a possibility for this team. That's not an irrational thought. That is this is a realistic ceiling for this team, and I think that should make fans really excited, because a 10-win season in 2021 at NC State, when you're in a division with Clemson, a perennial college football playoff contender every single season, that is absolutely something to celebrate and would be a huge success for this program. So those are my thoughts. If you want to read the entirety of these Q&As, hopefully we teased them enough for you. But no, there is still more to read. It would take us way too long to go over everything that was said in these interviews. So use that promo code PACK60 at thewolfpacker.com for a free 60-day trial on all of our premium content, news, and analysis, and it will unlock you access to read all of these Q&As, which are conveniently located on the front page of thewolfpacker.com right now. So head over there now, use that promo code PACK60. As a friendly reminder, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen to us. We're on the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, Google Play, everywhere you listen to podcasts. Plus, you can always watch us or listen to us on thewolfpacker.com. You can also watch us on our YouTube channel, where you should subscribe to our YouTube channel and give this video a thumbs up. If you're on our YouTube channel, go back and watch our podcast that we talked about with Joe Giglio, with Eric McLean of the ACC Network. We had one before last season with David Hale that you can go find. Go give those videos thumbs up too. Go give those videos a watch as well. So anyways, follow us on social media at The Wolfpacker is our main account. On Twitter, you can follow me personally at Justin H. Will, and give us a like on Facebook, NC State Wolfpack on thewolfpacker.com. For Matt Carter, this is Justin Williams, and this has been the Wolfpacker Podcast.